The wailing of an infant pierced the silence of Mill Creek's dusty churchyard as the storm clouds gathered over the distant mountains. Jane Johnston clutched her 3-month-old daughter Emily to her chest, trying to soothe the hungry, exhausted child as she sank to her knees beside the freshly dug grave. Colorado Territory, 1875, was an unforgiving place for a widow with a baby and nowhere to turn. "Hush now, sweet one," Jane whispered, her tears falling onto the simple wooden cross that marked her husband's final resting place. Thomas had been dead only 3 days, taken by the fever that had swept through their homestead with merciless speed. Now she was alone, with only $8 to her name and a baby who needed more than she could provide. The child's cries grew louder, echoing through the small cemetery behind the white clapboard church. Jane was so absorbed in her grief and worry that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they stopped just behind her. "Madam, you all right there?" The voice was deep, gentle, carrying the slight drawl of a man who'd spent too many years under the western sun. Jane turned, hastily wiping at her tears with her free hand. Standing over her was a tall figure silhouetted against the threatening sky. As he stepped closer, she could make out his features' sun-weathered skin, kind eyes the color of a summer storm, and a face framed by dark blonde hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn leather vest. "I'm fine, thank you," Jane lied, her voice cracking. But Emily's cries told a different story. The stranger knelt beside her, removing his hat respectfully. "Name's Garrett Daniels. Most folks call me Garrett." He glanced at the grave marker, then back at her face. "I'm mighty sorry for your loss, madam." Jane nodded, unable to speak as another wave of grief threatened to overwhelm her. Emily's cries reached a desperate pitch. "How long has the little one been crying like that?" Garrett asked, concern evident in his voice. "Too long," Jane admitted. "She's hungry and I haven't been able to." She couldn't finish the sentence. The truth was too painful to speak aloud that grief and exhaustion had dried up her milk, that she'd been unable to feed her child properly for a day now. Garrett seemed to understand without her having to explain. He stood and offered his hand. "My sister just had a baby 4 months back. She's staying at my ranch about 2 miles out. I reckon she could help with your little one, at least for tonight." Jane stared at his outstretched hand, hesitation warring with desperation. "I know you don't know me from Adam," Garrett continued softly, "but I can't in good conscience leave a mother and child out here with night coming on and that storm rolling in." As if to emphasize his point, a distant rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. Emily's crying had become a pitiful whimper, her tiny body trembling with exhaustion. Jane knew she had no choice. Pride wouldn't feed her baby. "Thank you," she said, placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, and his grip was sure as he helped her to her feet. With surprising gentleness, Garrett reached for the baby. Might be easier if you don't have to climb up holding her." After a moment's hesitation, Jane allowed him to take Emily. The baby's cries subsided slightly as Garrett cradled her against his chest, murmuring soft words of comfort that Jane couldn't quite hear. "Come on now," he said, turning toward a handsome chestnut gelding waiting patiently nearby. "Let's get you both somewhere warm and dry." In a smooth motion that spoke of years in the saddle, Garrett mounted his horse while still holding Emily securely. Then he reached down and helped Jane up behind him. She settled awkwardly, unsure where to place her hands until he said, "You'll want to hold on, madam. Wouldn't want you falling off." Tentatively, Jane placed her hands at his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his cotton shirt. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been this close to anyone other than Thomas. "Ready?" Garrett asked. "Yes," Jane replied, though she wasn't sure if she was ready for any of this, the kindness of a stranger, the uncertainty of tomorrow, the reality of her new life as a widow. As they rode away from the churchyard, Jane cast one final glance at Thomas's grave, silently promising to return. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, washing away her footprints from beside the grave. The storm broke in earnest just as they reached the Daniels ranch. It was larger than Jane had expected, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, all well maintained. Lamplight glowed in the windows, promising warmth and shelter from the deluge. Before they even reached the porch, the front door swung open, and a young woman with a round face and the same storm-gray eyes as Garrett appeared, a shawl hastily thrown over her shoulders. "Garrett." "What in heaven's name?" The woman stopped when she saw Jane and the baby, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding in an instant. "Bring them inside, quick now." Garrett dismounted first, still holding Emily with remarkable ease for a man who looked more at home with a lasso than a baby. He helped Jane down before striding toward the house, sheltering the infant from the rain with his own body. Once inside, Jane blinked in the sudden brightness of the well-lit home. It was modest but comfortable, with handmade quilts draped over solid furniture and the scent of fresh bread lingering in the air. "Sarah, this here is—" Garrett paused, looking at Jane with sudden embarrassment. "I'm sorry, madam, I never did ask your name." Jane Johnston," she supplied, pushing wet strands of auburn hair from her face. "And this is Emily." The woman Sarah stepped forward, her eyes on the fussing baby. "Your little one sounds hungry." "She is," Jane admitted, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I haven't been able to, that is, I don't seem to have." Sarah waved away her explanation with understanding. "Say no more. I've got plenty for two right now." She glanced at a cradle in the corner where Jane could see another infant sleeping soundly. "Let me take her." Jane hesitated only briefly before allowing Sarah to take Emily from Garrett's arms. The baby's cries intensified momentarily at the transfer, then quieted as Sarah spoke softly to her. "I'll just go feed her in the other room if that's all right with you," Sarah asked. Jane nodded gratefully. "Yes, thank you. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need for that talk," Sarah replied with a warm smile. "Any mother would do the same." She disappeared into an adjoining room with Emily, leaving Jane alone with Garrett. An awkward silence fell between them. Jane became acutely aware of her bedraggled appearance, her black mourning dress soaked through, her hair plastered to her neck, her eyes red and swollen from days of crying. "You must think me a terrible sight," she said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Garrett shook his head, removing his wet hat and hanging it on a hook by the door. "What I think is that you're a woman who's been through more than anyone should have to bear." He gestured to a chair near the hearth where a fire crackled merrily. "Please sit. Warm yourself." Jane sank gratefully into the offered chair, extending her hands toward the flames. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Just happened to be in the right place," Garrett said, moving to a cabinet and taking out 2 glasses and a bottle. "Whiskey. Might help ward off any chill." "No, thank you," Jane replied. "But please don't let me stop you." Garrett put the bottle back without pouring any for himself. Never was much of a drinker anyway. Instead, he moved to the stove and poured a cup of coffee from the pot, keeping warm there. "Coffee," this time Jane accepted, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm mug he brought her. "You're very kind, Mr. Daniels." "Garrett," he corrected gently. He pulled another chair closer to the fire and sat, his long legs stretched out before him. "If you don't mind my asking, how long has your husband been gone?" 3 days, Jane replied, the words catching in her throat. "We hadn't been in Mill Creek long. Thomas wanted to start fresh out west. He had dreams of building a cattle ranch." She stared into her coffee, watching the steam rise. He was sick for less than a week. The doctor called it mountain fever, said there wasn't anything to be done. Garrett nodded solemnly. The fever's out here, can take a man quick. I'm sorry. We were married just 2 years, Jane continued, the words spilling out now. Emily was born in June. Thomas was so proud. He had such plans for her future. A tear slipped down her cheek and she brushed it away quickly. I'm sorry. You didn't invite me here to listen to my troubles. No need to apologize for grief, Mrs. Johnston. It's as natural as breathing. Before Jane could respond, Sarah returned with Emily, who was now sleeping peacefully, her tiny face relaxed in contentment. She took to feeding like she was half-starved, poor lamb, Sarah said, gently transferring the sleeping baby back to Jane's arms. But she's had her fill now. Jane looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, relief washing over her. I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by telling me where you're staying so I know where to find you tomorrow, Sarah replied. I expect you'll need help with her again. Jane bit her lip. That is, I'm not sure where we'll be staying. Our wagon is still at the homestead site, about 5 miles outside town, but I can't manage there alone, not yet. I've been staying at the church, but the Reverend's wife said they couldn't keep us more than a few days. Sarah and Garrett exchanged a look that Jane couldn't quite decipher. You'll stay here tonight, Sarah announced with the certainty of someone not accustomed to having her decisions questioned. There's a spare room upstairs. Tomorrow we'll figure out what's next. I couldn't impose, Jane began. It's not an imposition, Garrett interrupted gently. We've got plenty of room, and it sounds like you need a place to catch your breath and make some plans. Jane wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was overtaking her, and the thought of a real bed, not the hard church pew she'd slept on for the past 2 nights, was too tempting to resist. Just for tonight, then, she conceded. And tomorrow I'll find work in town. I can sew, cook, clean, whatever's needed. Mill Creek's a small place, Garrett said, a slight frown creasing his brow. Jobs aren't easy to come by, especially for a woman with a young one to care for. I'll find something, Jane insisted, though her confidence was more feigned than felt. I have to. Sarah stepped forward. That's tomorrow's worry. Tonight you need rest. She gestured for Jane to follow her. Come along, I'll show you to your room. Jane rose, still cradling Emily, and followed Sarah up a narrow staircase to a small but clean bedroom with a simple iron bedstead, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. There are fresh linens in the chest, Sarah said, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. And I'll bring you something dry to sleep in. She paused at the door. My room is just across the hall if you need anything in the night, for you or the baby. After Sarah left, Jane stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Just hours ago, she had been kneeling in the churchyard, desperate and alone. Now she was in a stranger's home, shown more kindness in one evening than she had experienced since Thomas fell ill. She laid Emily gently in the center of the bed, building a protective barrier of pillows around her small form. Then she crossed to the window and looked out at the rain-swept landscape. In the distance, lightning illuminated the mountains, stark and beautiful against the night sky. "What am I going to do, Thomas?" she whispered to the storm. But only the thunder answered, rolling across the plains like the hoofbeats of 1,000 wild horses. The next morning, Jane woke to sunlight streaming through curtains she didn't recognize. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, then Emily's soft coos brought reality rushing back. Her husband was dead. She was in a stranger's home, and she had no idea what the future held. Emily was awake but content, batting at a sunbeam with her tiny fists. Jane picked her up, breathing in the sweet scent of her baby's skin. "Good morning, my love," she whispered, pressing a kiss to Emily's forehead. "Did you sleep well? I certainly did, better than I have in weeks." A soft knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. "Mrs. Johnston." "Are you awake?" Sarah's voice called. "Yes, please come in," Jane replied, quickly smoothing her hair with her free hand. Sarah entered carrying a bundle of clothing. "I thought these might fit you. They're some of my things from before the baby." She set them on the bed. "Breakfast is nearly ready downstairs. Garrett's already been out to the barn and back. That man rises with the roosters, I swear." "Thank you," Jane said, eyeing the clothes gratefully. Her black dress, though somewhat dried overnight, was wrinkled and stiff with dried mud at the hem. "I'll be down shortly." Once Sarah left, Jane dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue cotton dress that was perhaps a bit loose in the bodice, but otherwise fit well enough. She washed her face and hands in the basin, then braided her long auburn hair into a simple plait before gathering Emily and heading downstairs. The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of coffee, bacon, and freshly baked biscuits. Garrett stood at the window, a cup of coffee in hand, while Sarah bustled between the stove and table, her own baby now awake and settled in a high chair. "Good morning," Jane said softly, almost shy in the daylight among these people who were still strangers despite their kindness. Garrett turned, and for a moment, Jane caught an expression on his face that made her heart skip, something like appreciation, quickly masked by a polite smile. "Morning, Mrs. Johnston," he said, setting his cup down. "Hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you, and please call me Jane." Sarah gestured to a chair. Sit. Emily can go here beside Jacob." She indicated a second high chair that hadn't been in the room the night before. "Did you make that?" Jane asked, noticing the fresh wood and simple but sturdy construction. Garrett cleared his throat. "Put it together this morning. Had the wood left from building Jacob's. Figured it might be useful while you're staying with us." The casual mention of her staying with us, not just for a night, but as if her presence was expected for some time, caught Jane off guard. Before she could respond, Sarah spoke. "I've been thinking, Jane. We could use help around here, what with Jacob keeping me busy and the ranch hands to feed. If you're looking for work, maybe you could stay on for a while. Room and board for you and Emily, plus a small wage." Jane looked from Sarah to Garrett, searching for any sign that this offer wasn't genuine. "Are you certain? You barely know me." "I know enough," Sarah replied firmly. "I know you're a mother who loves her child. I know you're alone and in need of help. And I know I could use an extra pair of hands," she smiled. "Besides, Emily and Jacob seem to be getting along just fine." Jane glanced at the babies, who were indeed studying each other with the solemn curiosity of infants. "It would just be temporary," Jane said, more to herself than to them. "Until I can get back on my feet." Garrett set a plate of food in front of her. "No need to decide right this minute. Eat first. Everything looks clearer on a full stomach." The breakfast was simple but delicious, the best meal Jane had eaten in weeks. As she ate, Sarah chatted easily about the ranch, the small town of Mill Creek, and the people who lived there. Garrett said little, but Jane noticed how his gaze often drifted to Emily, a softness in his eyes that belied his rugged appearance. "You have children of your own, Garrett?" Jane asked during a lull in the conversation. A shadow passed over his face. "No, madam, never been married." "Garrett was engaged once," Sarah supplied, ignoring the warning look her brother shot her. "To Clara Winters, but she took ill before the wedding, 3 years ago now." "I'm sorry," Jane said sincerely. "It seems we've both known loss." Garrett nodded, his expression unreadable. "Difference is, you've got that little one there to remember your husband by. That's a blessing, even amidst the grief." Jane looked at Emily, who was now dozing in the high chair. "Yes, she is. The greatest blessing I could ask for. After breakfast, Sarah insisted on showing Jane around the ranch. The main house was larger than it had appeared the night before. 4 bedrooms upstairs, a spacious kitchen and living area downstairs, and a small study that Garrett used for the ranch's business. Our parents built this place, Sarah explained as they walked the property, babies in arms. Started with nothing but determination and hard work. When they passed, influenza took them both 5 years back. Garrett took over. He's built it into something they'd be proud of. Jane was indeed impressed. The Daniels ranch was clearly prosperous, a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse for the handful of ranch hands, and what looked to be about 50 head of cattle grazing in the distance. "It's beautiful," Jane said honestly. "Your brother must work very hard." "Too hard," Sarah agreed with a sigh. "He needs someone to remind him there's more to life than cattle and horses." She gave Jane a sidelong glance that made her blush inexplicably. "My husband had dreams of building a ranch like this," Jane said, changing the subject. "He bought a small plot of land just east of town, had plans drawn up and everything. But now—" She trailed off, the future once again looming uncertain before her. "What will you do with the land?" Sarah asked gently. "I don't know. Sell it, I suppose, if I can find a buyer." "The deed is in my name now. Thomas insisted on that when we purchased it. Said it was my security if anything happened to him." Her voice caught. "I don't think he expected anything to happen so soon." They had circled back to the house, where they found Garrett on the porch, cleaning a saddle. He stood as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "I need to ride into town for some supplies," he said. "Jane, I could stop by the church. Let the Reverend know you're staying with us for now. And if you'd like, I can check on your wagon at your homestead site." The offer was practical, thoughtful, another kindness she hadn't expected. "Yes, thank you. That would be very helpful." Sarah excused herself to put Jacob down for his morning nap, taking Emily along as well. Left alone with Garrett on the porch, Jane felt suddenly self-conscious. "Your ranch is impressive," she said, searching for something to say. "You must be very proud." Garrett's gaze swept over the property, pride evident in his eyes despite his modest response. "It's a good living, keeps me busy." "Too busy for a family of your own." The question slipped out before Jane could stop it. "I'm sorry, that's far too personal. Please forget I asked." But Garrett didn't seem offended. "There was a time I thought about it, after Clara." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say I found it easier to focus on things I could control. Cattle don't break your heart." The raw honesty in his voice touched something in Jane. "I understand that feeling. Right now, the thought of ever caring for someone again seems impossible. The risk of loss is too great." Garrett studied her face, his gray eyes thoughtful. "Yet here you are, loving that baby girl with everything you've got. That takes courage." "That's different," Jane protested. "She's my child." "Love is love," Garrett said simply, "and it always involves risk." He rose, setting the saddle aside. "I should get going if I want to be back before dark. Is there anything specific you need from town?" Jane shook her head. "No, but thank you for asking." As she watched him saddle his horse and ride away, Jane found herself wondering about the man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. There was a steadiness to Garrett Daniels that reminded her of the mountains in the distance, solid, reliable, enduring. It was a comforting thought, even as she reminded herself that her stay here was temporary, just until she could find her footing again. The days began to take on a rhythm. Jane helped Sarah with cooking and household tasks, grateful for the opportunity to earn her keep. The babies thrived together, and Jane found her own strength returning both physically and emotionally. The raw edge of grief began to soften. not disappearing but becoming something she could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. A week passed, then two. Garrett rode out to Jane's homestead site and reported that the wagon was intact, though weather-beaten. He'd brought back a trunk of her belongings, clothes for her and Emily, a few mementos and Thomas's pocket watch, which Jane had feared might have been stolen. "I can take you out there when you're ready," Garrett offered one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. Sarah had already gone upstairs with the babies, leaving them alone in the gathering twilight. "To see the land, make plans for what you want to do with it." Jane nodded, turning Thomas's watch over in her hands. "Soon. I should decide what to do before winter sets in." She glanced at Garrett. "What would you do if you were me?" He considered the question seriously. "Depends on what you want long term. If you aim to go back east, selling makes sense. If you want to stay in these parts." He hesitated. "Land's a valuable thing out here, more valuable than money in some ways." "I have nowhere to go back east," Jane admitted. "Thomas and I sold everything to come west. There's nothing waiting for me there." She looked out at the darkening landscape. "But I can't work a ranch on my own, especially with Emily to care for." "You could take on a partner," Garrett suggested. "Someone with the know-how and strength for the physical work, in exchange for a share of the profits once it's up and running." The idea had merit, Jane had to admit. "Do you know anyone who might be interested in such an arrangement?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe. Let me think on it." The next day, Garrett took Jane to see her land. It was a beautiful piece of property, 20 acres with a natural spring, a stand of cottonwoods and rolling grassland that would be perfect for grazing cattle. Thomas had begun constructing a small cabin, the foundation laid and walls partially framed. "He did good work," Garrett observed, examining the structure. "Solid foundation, good timber. Wouldn't take much to finish it before winter." Jane walked through what would have been their home, trying to imagine the life Thomas had planned for them. "He was so excited about this place. Said it was where Emily would learn to walk, where we'd build our future." Garrett watched her carefully. "What are you thinking, Jane?" She turned to face him, decision crystallizing in her mind. "I don't want to sell. Not yet, at least. Thomas believed in this land. I think I owe it to his memory to try." A smile spread across Garrett's face, the first full, unguarded smile she'd seen from him. "I was hoping you'd say that." "But I still have the same problem," Jane reminded him. "I can't work it alone." "I've been thinking on that," Garrett said, stepping closer. What if I helped you? In my spare time at first, then maybe more seriously if things work out." Jane stared at him, surprised by the offer. "Why would you do that? You have your own ranch to run." "I've got good men working for me. Frank's been my foreman for 8 years. He can handle more responsibility." Garrett looked around at the land, appreciation evident in his gaze. "And this is good land, Jane. With the right management, it could be profitable within a year or two." "As a business arrangement?" Jane asked carefully. Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or hope. "For now, yes, if that's what you're comfortable with." The unspoken possibility hung between them, neither ready to acknowledge it directly. Instead, Jane extended her hand. "Thank you, Garrett, I accept your offer." His hand enveloped hers, warm and strong. "Partners, then." The word felt significant, weighted with potential that went beyond business. But for now, it was enough. Over the following weeks, Garrett split his time between his own ranch and Jane's property. He hired 2 men from town to help finish the cabin, working alongside them whenever he could. Jane often brought Emily out to the site, spreading a blanket under the cottonwoods where she could watch the progress while keeping the baby entertained. One warm afternoon, in late September, Jane arrived to find Garrett working alone, hammering shingles onto the nearly completed roof. He didn't notice her approach, and she took a moment to observe the easy strength in his movements, the focused intensity of his expression, the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his hair. Something warm unfurled in her chest, a feeling she recognized with both anticipation and trepidation. It had been growing steadily these past weeks, her admiration for his kindness, her appreciation of his steady presence, her awareness of him as a man. But guilt followed closely behind. Thomas was barely 2 months in his grave. Was it disloyal to feel this way about another man so soon? Garrett spotted her then, his serious expression transforming into a welcoming smile. He descended the ladder with quick efficiency, wiping his hands on his pants as he approached. "Didn't expect to see you until later," he said, bending to chuck Emily under the chin. The baby gurgled happily, recognizing the man who had become a constant in her young life. "Sarah said you were baking today." "Finished early," Jane replied, handing him the basket she carried. "I brought lunch. I thought you might be hungry." Garrett peeked under the cloth covering. "Fried chicken. You're spoiling me, Jane Johnston." They sat in the shade of the cottonwoods, spreading their impromptu picnic on Jane's blanket. Emily lay between them, contently gumming a wooden teething ring Garrett had carved for her. "The cabin will be finished next week," Garrett said between bites. "Just in time, too. Nights are getting colder." Jane looked at the structure that would soon be her home. It was small but well built, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that would catch both the morning and evening light. "I can hardly believe it's real." "Believe it," Garrett said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "By this time next week, you and Emily will be settled in your own home." The thought brought both excitement and a touch of sadness. "We've imposed on you and Sarah for so long. I'll miss seeing you both every day." Garrett's eyes met hers. "It's only 2 miles between the ranch and here. And I'll still be coming over regular to work on getting the fencing up and the barn built before winter." "Still," Jane said softly, "it won't be the same." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by Emily's contented noises and the rustle of leaves overhead. Finally, Garrett spoke, his voice lower than before. "Jane, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." He seemed uncharacteristically nervous, fingers fidgeting with a blade of grass. Jane's heart quickened. "Yes." Before Garrett could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. They both turned to see 3 riders approaching, men Jane didn't recognize. Garrett was on his feet in an instant, his posture alert but not yet alarmed. "Stay here with Emily," he said quietly, moving toward the approaching riders. Jane gathered Emily into her arms, watching as Garrett greeted the men. The conversation appeared civil enough, though she couldn't hear what was being said. One of the men, tall, with a black hat and a carefully trimmed beard, seemed to be doing most of the talking, occasionally gesturing toward the cabin and the surrounding land. After several minutes, Garrett shook his head firmly. The bearded man's posture stiffened, and even from a distance, Jane could sense the conversation had taken an unpleasant turn. Finally, the 3 men turned their horses and rode away, but not before the leader cast a long look in Jane's direction that sent a chill down her spine. Garrett returned to the blanket, his expression troubled. "Who were they?" Jane asked, keeping her voice steady despite her unease. "Wade Harrington and 2 of his men," Garrett replied, sitting back down beside her. "He owns the big spread north of town, the Double H. Been buying up all the small homesteads in the area for the past year." "What did he want?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "To buy your land. Said he'd give you a fair price, better than you'd get from anyone else." "I'm not selling," Jane said firmly. "That's what I told him." Garrett picked up a stick and began breaking it into smaller pieces, a gesture Jane had come to recognize as a sign he was troubled. He wasn't pleased. Harrington's not used to hearing no. "Is he dangerous?" Jane asked, instinctively holding Emily closer. Garrett considered the question. "Not outright. He's too concerned with his reputation in town to do anything openly illegal, but he's not above putting pressure on people who stand in his way." He looked at Jane directly. "He wanted me to convince you to sell. Implied there might be something in it for me if I did." Jane felt a flash of indignation. "As if you would." A hint of a smile touched Garrett's lips. "Glad you have such faith in me." "I do," Jane said simply. And she realized it was true in the weeks she'd known him. Garrett Daniels had proven himself to be a man of unwavering integrity. "So what happens now?" "Now we finish your cabin and get you and Emily settled," Garrett said, his tone brooking no argument. "Harrington can bluster all he wants, but this is your land, fair and square." The matter seemed settled, but as they packed up their picnic, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that Wade Harrington wasn't a man who gave up easily. The cabin was finished the following week, just as Garrett had promised. Sarah helped Jane settle in, bringing curtains she'd sewn for the windows and a small rocking chair that had belonged to their mother. "It's perfect," Jane said, standing in the middle of the main room, which served as both kitchen and living area. The second room, smaller but cozy, would be her and Emily's bedroom. "I can't believe it's mine." "You deserve this," Sarah said, giving her a quick hug, "and it's close enough that we can still see each other often. Jacob would miss Emily terribly otherwise." Jane smiled, touched by how intertwined their lives had become. "I'd miss you both too much to stay away." That evening, after Sarah had returned to the Daniels ranch, Garrett arrived with a final delivery, a small wooden cradle he'd made for Emily. "I noticed you didn't have a proper place for her to sleep," he explained, setting it down in the bedroom. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the wood sanded smooth and polished to a warm glow. "Figured she deserves better than that makeshift basket you've been using." Jane ran her fingers over the cradle, touched beyond words by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful, Garrett, thank you." He shrugged, clearly pleased by her reaction but embarrassed by her gratitude. "It's nothing fancy, just something I worked on in the evenings." "It's perfect," Jane insisted. She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the small bedroom. "You've done so much for us. I don't know if I can ever repay you." "I don't want repayment," Garrett said, his voice dropping lower. "Jane, what I was trying to ask you the other day before we were interrupted." Jane's heart raced. "Yes," Garrett took a deep breath. "I know it hasn't been long since you lost Thomas, and I would never want to rush you or disrespect his memory, but I find myself thinking about you. A lot. More than is probably proper for just business partners or friends." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Jane felt her cheeks warm. "I think about you too," she admitted softly. "And sometimes I feel guilty for it, like I'm betraying Thomas somehow." Garrett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I can't imagine what you're going through, and I'm not asking for any promises, just permission, I guess, to call on you properly, to see if there might be something here worth exploring when you're ready." Jane looked up at this man who had become so important to her in such a short time. The thought of turning him away made her chest ache. "I'd like that, but I need time, Garrett, to be sure." Relief washed over his features. "Time is something I can give. I'm not going anywhere, Jane." As if sensing the significance of the moment, Emily began to fuss from her basket in the other room. Jane moved to go to her, but Garrett gently touched her arm. "Let me," he said. Jane watched as he picked up Emily with the ease of long practice, cradling her against his chest and murmuring soft words that made the baby's cries subside. Something shifted in her heart at the sight, a certainty that, whatever happened between them, Garrett Daniels would always treat her daughter with the same tenderness he showed now. "Stay for supper," Jane asked. "It's nothing fancy, but there's plenty." Garrett smiled, still holding Emily. "I'd like that very much." The next few weeks passed in a pleasant rhythm. Garrett came by almost daily, working on fencing the property and beginning construction on a small barn. Jane kept busy making the cabin a home and tending to Emily, who grew more alert and responsive by the day. True to his word, Garrett never pushed for more than Jane was ready to give. Their relationship remained ostensibly that of neighbors and business partners, though the growing affection between them was evident to anyone who cared to look, especially Sarah, who watched their careful dance with barely concealed approval. "He smiles more now," she told Jane one afternoon as they hung laundry behind the cabin. "I haven't seen him this happy since before Clara died." Jane blushed, securing a sheet to the line. "We're taking things slowly." "As you should," Sarah agreed, "but don't take too long. My brother's a patient man, but life out here is unpredictable. When happiness presents itself, you'd be wise to grab it with both hands." The wisdom of Sarah's advice became apparent sooner than Jane could have anticipated. October brought an early snowfall, coating the landscape in white and keeping Garrett at his own ranch for 3 days straight. Jane found herself watching the road anxiously, missing his presence more than she cared to admit. When he finally appeared on the 4th day, his horse trudging through the melting snow, Jane felt such relief that she ran out to meet him, Emily bundled in her arms. "I was worried," she said as he dismounted, not bothering to hide her concern. Garrett's face softened. "Sorry about that." The snow brought down some fencing on the North Range. Had to round up strays before they wandered too far. He reached for Emily, who greeted him with excited babbling. "Did you miss me, little one? I sure missed you." "We both did," Jane admitted, leading the way back to the cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the smell of stew cooking created a welcoming atmosphere that made Garrett sigh with contentment. "Feels like coming home," he said, almost to himself. Jane heard the words and felt their weight. This man who had entered her life so unexpectedly had become essential to it, filling spaces she hadn't even realized were empty. The realization both frightened and exhilarated her. They ate supper together, talking about the ranch, the weather, plans for expanding the fenced area come spring. Ordinary conversation that felt anything but ordinary to Jane. When Emily fell asleep, Garrett carefully placed her in the cradle he'd made, his large hands gentle as they tucked the blanket around her tiny form. "She looks more like you every day," he observed, straightening up. Jane smiled. "Everyone says she has Thomas's chin, though." The mention of her late husband didn't create the awkwardness it might have once. Garrett simply nodded. "He'd be proud of how you're raising her." "I hope so," Jane said softly. "I want her to know about him when she's older. To understand what kind of man her father was." "She will," Garrett assured her, "because you'll tell her." They moved back to the main room, settling before the fire. Jane had been working on a quilt, and she picked up her needle, finding comfort in the familiar task. Garrett watched her hands move deftly through the fabric. "You're good at that," he observed. Jane smiled, pleased by his notice. "My grandmother taught me, said a woman should know how to create beauty as well as practicality." "Wise woman," Garrett commented. He seemed on the verge of saying more when a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Jane looked up, startled. Visitors were rare, especially after dark. Garrett was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip, a gesture so subtle Jane almost missed it. "Stay here," he said quietly, moving to the door. When he opened it, Jane was surprised to see Reverend Miller from the church in Mill Creek standing on her porch, his hat in his hands. "Evening, Garrett," the Reverend said, nodding respectfully. "Mrs. Johnston." I apologize for calling so late, but the matter couldn't wait until morning. Garrett stepped aside to let him enter. What's happened, Reverend? The older man came in, declining Jane's offer of coffee with a polite shake of his head. I came to warn you both. Wade Harrington was in town today, making some troubling claims. Jane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. What kind of claims? The Reverend looked uncomfortable. He's suggesting that your ownership of this land might not be as straightforward as it appears. He says he has evidence that your husband purchased it with borrowed money loaned by Harrington himself, with the land as collateral. That's ridiculous, Jane said immediately. Thomas paid for this land outright. We saved for years to come west. Be that as it may, the Reverend continued, Harrington is preparing to file a legal claim. I thought you should know so you can gather whatever documentation you have regarding the purchase. Garrett's expression had darkened. This is a bluff. Harrington's trying to scare Jane into selling before he has to resort to more direct methods. Perhaps, the Reverend agreed, but bluff or not, you'd be wise to take it seriously. Harrington has influence with Judge Wilson. After the Reverend left, promising to keep them informed of any developments, Jane sat heavily in her chair, the quilt forgotten in her lap. Thomas wouldn't have borrowed money without telling me, she said, though a thread of doubt crept into her voice. Would he? Garrett knelt beside her chair. Do you have the deed, and any papers related to the purchase? Jane nodded. In Thomas's trunk. I haven't looked at them since he died. Together, they retrieved the trunk from the bedroom and opened it on the kitchen table. Among Thomas's clothes and personal effects, they found a leather folder containing several documents, the deed to the land, clearly showing Thomas and Jane Johnston as the owners, a receipt for the purchase price paid to the previous owner, and a small notebook that appeared to be a record of their finances. Jane flipped through the notebook, her brow furrowing as she examined the entries. I don't see any record of a loan from Harrington or anyone else, just our savings and the money from selling our house back east. Garrett examined the deed carefully. This looks perfectly in order. Your name is right here alongside Thomas's. If there was a loan with the land as collateral, it would have to be recorded. Relief washed over Jane. So Harrington is lying. It appears so, Garrett agreed, though his expression remained troubled. But that doesn't mean he won't cause problems. Men like him are used to getting their way. What should we do? Jane asked, suddenly feeling very vulnerable in her isolated cabin. Garrett thought for a moment. First thing tomorrow, I'll ride into town and have a word with Judge Wilson. Make sure he knows the facts before Harrington can spin his tale. Then I'll stop by the land office and get a copy of the original filing, just to be safe. Jane nodded, grateful for his decisive action. Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you. Garrett's expression softened. You'd manage. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. He hesitated, then added, but I'm glad you don't have to face this alone. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings. Jane found herself studying his face, the strong lines of his jaw, the kindness in his gray eyes, the slight scar above his right eyebrow that she'd never asked about. In that moment, she knew with sudden clarity that she was falling in love with Garrett Daniels. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it brought a sense of peace, as if her heart had known all along and was simply waiting for her mind to catch up. It's getting late, Garrett said finally, breaking the spell. I should head back to the ranch. You could stay, Jane offered, surprising herself with her boldness. On the chair by the fire, I mean. It's a long ride back in the dark and with Harrington stirring up trouble. Garrett considered the offer, clearly tempted. Are you sure? I wouldn't want to cause talk. Who's to talk? Jane asked with a small smile. It's just us out here, and I'd feel safer knowing you were close by. That settled it. Garrett nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and something warmer. Then I'll stay, just for tonight. Jane fetched blankets and a pillow, arranging them on the chair that could recline into a passable, if not comfortable, bed. As she did, she was acutely aware of Garrett moving about the cabin, banking the fire for the night, checking that the door was securely latched. It felt so natural having him there, as if the small space had been waiting for his presence to make it truly complete. "Good night, Garrett," she said softly, pausing at her bedroom door. He looked up, the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. "Good night, Jane. Sleep well." In her bedroom, with Emily sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Jane lay awake for a long time, listening to the occasional creak of the chair as Garrett shifted his weight, finding comfort in the knowledge that he was just on the other side of the door. Whatever Harrington was planning, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The next morning, Jane woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Garrett's low voice singing softly to Emily. She lay still for a moment, savoring the domesticity of it, before rising and dressing quickly. In the main room, she found Garrett by the stove, Emily propped against his shoulder as he flipped hotcakes in a skillet with his free hand. The baby was wide-eyed and contented, clearly enchanted by the man holding her. "You're full of surprises," Jane said, announcing her presence. "I didn't know you could cook." Garrett turned, a smile lighting his face. "Bachelor living teaches a man a few things. Though I'll admit, cooking one-handed is a new challenge." He nodded toward Emily. This little lady woke up hungry, but she was content to watch the proceedings rather than join in the conversation. Jane crossed to them, brushing a kiss on Emily's head before taking her from Garrett's arms. "Thank you for tending to her, and for breakfast." "Least I could do for imposing on your hospitality," he replied, returning his attention to the hot cakes. "I should head to town soon if I want to catch Judge Wilson before court convenes." They ate breakfast together, discussing strategy for dealing with Harrington's claim. Garrett was confident that the documentation they had would be sufficient to prove Jane's rightful ownership, but he didn't underestimate Harrington's determination or resources. "Just stay close to home today," he advised as he prepared to leave. "I don't think Harrington would try anything directly, but better safe than sorry." Jane nodded, trying not to show her anxiety. "Be careful in town. Harrington must have friends there." "I can handle Harrington and his friends," Garrett assured her, his tone leaving no room for doubt. He hesitated at the door, then stepped back and with gentle deliberation pressed a kiss to Jane's forehead. "I'll be back before sundown." The gesture, simple as it was, left Jane feeling warm and flustered long after Garrett had ridden away. She touched the spot where his lips had touched her skin, smiling to herself despite the worry that clouded the day ahead. True to his promise, Garrett returned before sunset, looking satisfied if somewhat weary. Jane had been watching for him and met him at the door, eager for news. Judge Wilson was skeptical of Harrington's claim from the start, Garrett reported, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "When I showed him copies of the deed and receipt, he said there wasn't enough evidence to even consider Harrington's petition. He's dismissing it formally tomorrow." Relief washed over Jane. "So it's over. Harrington can't take the land." Garrett's expression grew more serious. "The legal challenge is over before it began, but I doubt Harrington will give up so easily. Men like him aren't used to losing." "What will he do next?" Jane asked, instinctively glancing toward Emily, who was playing contentedly on a blanket near the fire. Garrett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Hard to say. He might try to find another angle of attack, or he might decide the land isn't worth the trouble." He looked at Jane directly. "Or he might try to pressure you more directly." "You think he would threaten me?" The thought sent a chill through Jane. I don't think he'd do anything outright illegal, Garrett clarified, but he might make living here difficult, scare off any help you try to hire, spread rumors in town, that sort of thing. Jane considered this, her determination rising to meet the threat. Then we'll just have to be prepared for whatever he tries. A smile touched Garrett's lips. That's the spirit. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small package. I brought something for Emily, from the mercantile in town. Jane unwrapped it to find a small wooden horse, beautifully carved and polished. It's lovely, Garrett. Thank you. Figured every ranch girl should have her first horse, he said with a wink, crouching down to show the toy to Emily. The baby reached for it eagerly, her small fingers closing around the wooden figure. Watching them together, Garrett's large hands guiding Emily's tiny ones as she examined her new treasure, Jane felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. This was what she wanted, what she hadn't even known she was missing until now, not just security or partnership, but family. A complete circle again. Stay for supper, she said, making a sudden decision. And stay the night again if you would, not just because of Harrington, but because. She faltered, searching for the right words. Garrett looked up at her, his eyes serious and intent. Because, Jane took a deep breath. Because I sleep better knowing you're near. Because Emily lights up when she sees you. Because this place feels more like home when you're in it. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Garrett rose slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Jane, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Are you saying what I think you're saying? She nodded, her heart pounding. I think I am. I know it hasn't been long and maybe it's too soon, but life is short and uncertain and She didn't get to finish. With 2 strides, Garrett was before her, his hands gently cradling her face. May I? He asked softly. Yes, Jane whispered. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle yet certain, conveying months of unspoken longing and newfound hope. Jane's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally parted, Garrett pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I've been wanting to do that since I found you in that churchyard, he admitted. Even then, sad as you were, something in me recognized something in you. Jane smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I was so lost that day. I never imagined that the stranger on horseback would become so important to us. She glanced at Emily, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes. She approves, I think. Garrett chuckled, turning to wink at the baby. Good to know I have the support of both Johnston women. The evening that followed was filled with a new ease between them. They prepared supper together, talked about their hopes for the ranch, and made plans for the coming winter. When Emily fell asleep, Garrett carried her to her cradle, his movements now practiced and confident. Later, as they sat before the fire, Garrett took Jane's hand in his expression turning serious again. I want you to know, he said carefully, that I don't expect anything to change overnight. We can take this as slow as you need. I understand that you're still healing, still finding your way forward. Jane squeezed his hand gratefully. Thank you for understanding. But I'm not as fragile as I was when we first met. Grief doesn't disappear, but it changes, makes room for new feelings. She looked at him directly. And what I feel for you, Garrett, is very real. It doesn't dishonor Thomas's memory. If anything, having loved him helps me recognize what I'm beginning to feel for you. Relief softened Garrett's features. I wasn't sure if you were ready, if it was too soon. Life is too short for unnecessary waiting, Jane said, echoing Sarah's earlier wisdom. Especially out here. Garrett's smile was warm with promise. Then we'll move forward together, at whatever pace feels right. The following weeks brought a deepening of their relationship, even as winter tightened its grip on the land. Garrett split his time between his own ranch and Jane's homestead, gradually bringing over more of his belongings until it became clear to them both that the arrangement was more than temporary. Jane found herself blossoming under his steady affection. The grief that had once consumed her didn't vanish, but it settled into a quieter place in her heart, making room for new joy. Emily thrived as well, developing an attachment to Garrett that was beautiful to witness. Their courtship was unconventional by most standards, shaped by practical concerns as much as by romance. Together, they completed the small barn, prepared the cabin for the harsh winter ahead, and continued planning for the spring, when they would bring the first cattle to the new ranch. Through it all, the shadow of Wade Harrington's interest in the land remained. Though he made no further legal moves, Jane occasionally spotted riders from the Double H passing by the property, watching. Garrett took the precaution of asking two of his most trusted ranch hands to stay in the partially finished barn when he couldn't be there himself, ostensibly to work on completing it, but really to ensure Jane and Emily weren't alone. As Christmas approached, Garrett invited Jane and Emily to spend the holiday at the main ranch with him and Sarah. "The snow's getting deep," he pointed out. "Might be safer for you both to be there until after New Year's." Jane agreed readily, looking forward to the festive atmosphere and the chance to repay some of Sarah's kindness by helping with the holiday preparations. They arrived at the Daniels Ranch 3 days before Christmas, welcomed by a house already decorated with pine boughs and handmade ornaments. "I'm so glad you're here," Sarah said, embracing Jane warmly. "It's been too quiet with just me and Jacob rattling around this big house while Garrett's been spending all his time at your place." The teasing comment brought a blush to Jane's cheeks, though she knew Sarah approved wholeheartedly of the developing relationship between her brother and Jane. The days leading up to Christmas were filled with baking, decorating, and preparing gifts. Jane had sewn a new dress for Sarah, a warm coat for Jacob, and for Garrett, a fine shirt of soft blue cotton that she hoped would bring out the color of his eyes. For Emily, she'd fashioned a small rag doll with embroidered features and yarn hair. On Christmas Eve, after the children were asleep, the 3 adults gathered in the main room, enjoying mulled cider before the fire. Sarah, clearly fighting to stay awake after the busy day, finally excused herself to bed, leaving Jane and Garrett alone. "I have something for you," Garrett said after a moment, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until tomorrow, but—" He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Jane untied it carefully, aware of Garrett watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Inside the paper was a small velvet box. Her breath caught as she opened it to reveal a ring, a delicate gold band set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Garrett explained, his voice unusually hesitant. "My father gave it to her when he asked her to marry him. They didn't have much then, couldn't afford diamonds, but she always said the pearl meant more because it was something beautiful born from difficulty." Jane looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Garrett." He took the box from her, removing the ring with fingers that trembled slightly. "I know this might seem sudden to some, but out here, life doesn't always give you the luxury of waiting. When you know something's right, you hold on to it." He took her left hand in his. "Jane Johnston, you came into my life unexpected, but now I can't imagine my life without you, without Emily. I love you both, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my days proving it." His eyes, steady and full of emotion, held hers. "Will you marry me?" Jane felt tears welling in her eyes, not tears of grief this time, but of joy, of wonder at how life could change so completely in such a short time. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. Yes, Garrett, I'll marry you. The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. Garrett drew her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all the years ahead. When they finally parted, Jane rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. When? She asked simply. Garrett's arms tightened around her. As soon as you're ready. Spring, maybe, when the snow melts and the land comes back to life. Jane considered this, thinking of the cabin that had become a home because of his presence, of Emily who already looked to him as a father, of the future they were building together day by day. What about New Year's Day? She suggested, looking up at him. A new year, a new beginning, why wait for spring? Surprise and delight crossed Garrett's face. New Year's Day, you're certain? Jane nodded, more sure than she had been of anything in a long time. I'm certain. I want to start the year as your wife, with no more nights apart, no more divided lives. Garrett's smile was radiant. Then New Year's Day it is. We'll ask Reverend Miller to perform the ceremony here at the ranch. They stayed up late into the night, planning their simple wedding and the life they would build together. Jane felt a peace she hadn't known in months, the certainty that, despite all the loss and hardship, she had found her way home. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. Sarah was ecstatic, immediately throwing herself into wedding preparations despite the short notice. The ranch hands offered hearty congratulations, clearly approving of the match. Only one shadow fell across their happiness. 2 days after Christmas, one of Garrett's men rode in from town with troubling news. Wade Harrington had been heard making threats against Garrett, blaming him for interfering in what should have been a simple land acquisition. He was drunk at the saloon, the ranch hand reported. Said you'd regret crossing him, that he always collects what's owed to him one way or another. Garrett dismissed the threat as empty talk, but Jane noticed he doubled the number of men patrolling the property boundaries and made sure she and Emily were never alone, even for a short time. The precautions were sensible, but they cast a pall over what should have been a purely joyful time. On the morning of December 31, as final preparations for the next day's wedding were underway, Jane found a moment alone with Garrett on the porch of the main house. "Are you worried?" She asked directly, having learned that honesty between them was always best. Garrett considered the question before answering. Not worried enough to change any plans. Harrington's the type who makes threats when his pride is wounded, but he's not foolish enough to act on them. Too much to lose. Jane studied his face, looking for any sign that he was merely trying to reassure her, but found only calm certainty. "I trust your judgment. I just don't want our wedding day overshadowed by this." "It won't be," Garrett promised, taking her hands in his. "Tomorrow is about us, you, me, Emily, the family we're building together. Nothing and no one else matters." The conviction in his voice reassured her. Jane leaned into his embrace, allowing herself to focus on the joy ahead rather than the potential threats behind. New Year's Day dawned clear and cold, the snow-covered landscape glittering in the morning sunlight as if nature itself had dressed for the occasion. The main room of the Daniels ranch house had been transformed, with evergreen boughs adorning the walls and white ribbons festooning the chairs borrowed from neighbors who would soon fill them. Jane stood in Sarah's room, gazing at her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress, hastily altered from one of Sarah's best gowns, was a simple affair of cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in a neat chignon adorned with a small spray of winter berries. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, adjusting the back of the dress. "Garrett won't know what hit him." Jane smiled, her heart full. "I still can't quite believe this is happening. 3 months ago I was alone in that churchyard, not knowing how I would survive the winter. And now you're building a new life," Sarah finished for her, squeezing her shoulders. "A good life." Emily, dressed in a tiny white dress that Sarah had sewn, sat on the bed, contentedly playing with a ribbon. She seemed to sense the significance of the day, behaving with unusual patience as she was bathed and dressed. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of Reverend Miller's wife, who would watch the children during the ceremony. "It's time, dear," she said warmly. "Everyone's seated, and that handsome brother of yours, Sarah, is looking like he might wear a hole in the floor with his pacing." Sarah laughed. "That sounds like Garrett, always calm in a crisis, but ask him to stand still for a wedding and he turns into a nervous colt." Jane took a final look in the mirror, then bent to pick up Emily. "Let's not keep him waiting then." The main room fell silent as Jane appeared in the doorway, Emily in her arms. A dozen familiar faces turned toward her neighbors, friends, the ranch hands who had become like family. But Jane saw only Garrett, standing tall and proud before the fireplace where Reverend Miller waited to join them in marriage. He wore a new black suit and the blue shirt Jane had made for him, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. But it was his expression that caught at her heart, a look of such wonder and love that it nearly took her breath away. The walk across the room seemed both endless and too brief. When she reached Garrett's side, he wordlessly offered his arm, steady and strong beside her. Emily, sensing the solemnity of the moment, remained unusually quiet, her wide eyes taking in the scene. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Miller began, his voice warm and carrying in the hushed room, "we are gathered here on this first day of a new year to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When it came time for the vows, Garrett's voice rang clear and certain. "I, Garrett, take you, Jane, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." As Jane repeated the words, Emily reached out unexpectedly toward Garrett. Without hesitation, he took the baby into his arms, holding her with practiced ease as Jane completed her vows. The spontaneous moment brought smiles and a few tears from those watching. "By the power vested in me," the Reverend concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." With Emily still in one arm, Garrett gently cupped Jane's face with his free hand and sealed their vows with a tender kiss. The room erupted in applause and cheers, but Jane heard only the beating of her own heart and Emily's delighted gurgle as Garrett drew back, his eyes shining with joy. "Mrs. Daniels," he said softly, testing the name. Jane smiled, her hand coming to rest on his where it held Emily secure. "My husband," she replied, the words feeling right and true on her lips. The celebration that followed was joyous, a feast prepared by Sarah and the ranch cook. Music from a fiddle played by one of the hands, dancing that lasted well into the evening. Through it all, Jane felt a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever when Thomas died. As night fell and the guests began to depart, Garrett drew Jane aside, Emily sleeping soundly against his shoulder. "I have one more surprise for you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his smile. "I hope you'll approve." He led her to the study, where a lamp burned low on the desk. Laid out on the polished surface was a document Jane recognized as the deed to her land. "I had a talk with Judge Wilson yesterday," Garrett explained. "Asked him to make a change to the deed." Jane looked closer and saw that the document had indeed been altered. Where once it had read Thomas and Jane Johnston, it now stated Jane and Garrett Daniels. "You added your name," she said, looking up at him. Garrett nodded, shifting Emily's weight slightly. "And I had him remove Thomas's." "I hope that was the right thing to do. I didn't want there to be any confusion about ownership, especially with Harrington still causing trouble. But if it bothers you—" Jane touched the document, tracing the new names with her fingertip. "It doesn't bother me," she assured him. "It's practical and it's right. The land is ours now, yours, mine, Emily's, our family's legacy." Relief crossed Garrett's face. "That's what I hoped you'd say." He glanced down at Emily, then back at Jane. "There's one more thing. I've been thinking about the cabin." "What about it?" Jane asked. "It's a good start," Garrett said carefully. "But I'm wondering if, come spring, you might consider building something a bit larger, a proper home for our family, the kind that can grow with us over the years." The implication warmed Jane's heart. "You want more children?" Garrett's smile was tender. "I'd like that very much, if you would. Not to replace Emily's place as your firstborn, but to give her brothers and sisters to grow up with." Jane stepped closer, wrapping her arms around both Garrett and Emily, creating a circle of family that felt complete and yet open to growth at the same time. "I'd like that too," she said softly. "Very much." They stood that way for a long moment, savoring the beginning of their life together. Outside, the stars shone clear and bright in the winter sky, promising a new year full of possibility. 10 years later, Jane stood on the porch of the 2-story house that had replaced the original cabin, watching as Garrett taught 9-year-old Emily to ride her new pony. The girl's laughter carried across the yard, bright and fearless, as she urged the gentle creature into a trot under her father's watchful eye. Near the corral, their 7-year-old son Thomas and 5-year-old daughter Sarah played with the barn kittens while baby Michael, just beginning to toddle, stayed close to Jane, clutching the hem of her skirt with chubby fingers. The Daniels ranch had prospered over the past decade, growing to encompass both Garrett's original property and what had once been Jane's homestead. The house stood at the center of it all, a testament to the family they had built together, room by room, year by year. Wade Harrington had eventually abandoned his pursuit of the land, finding easier targets for his expansion. The last Jane had heard, he'd moved to California after losing much of his fortune in bad investments. As Garrett helped Emily dismount, praising her progress, Jane's mind drifted back to that cold day in the churchyard when a stranger on horseback had stopped to help a grieving widow and her crying baby. How different her life would have been if Garrett hadn't happened to ride by that day, if he hadn't carried them both first to his home and later to the altar beside him. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Daniels," Garrett said, approaching the porch with Emily skipping alongside him, her face flushed with excitement. Jane smiled at her husband, taking in the silver now threading through his hair at the temples, the laugh lines that framed his still handsome face. "I was just thinking how fortunate we are," she replied. "How blessed." Garrett climbed the steps and pressed a kiss to her forehead, still his favorite gesture of affection after all these years. "That we are," he agreed, his arm encircling her waist as they watched their children play in the yard that had become the heart of their shared lives. Emily looked up at them, her smile so like Jane's bright in the afternoon sun. "Papa says I can ride all the way to Uncle Frank's tomorrow if I'm careful." "Did he now?" Jane raised an eyebrow at her husband, who had the grace to look slightly abashed. "With supervision, of course," Garrett amended. Jane laughed, the sound as free and joyous as Emily's had been earlier. "Of course." As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, casting long shadows across their land, Jane felt the familiar weight of gratitude that had become as much a part of her daily life as breathing. For the home they had built, for the children they had raised, for the love that had found them both when they least expected it. But most of all, for that moment of grace in a churchyard long ago, when her baby's cries had drawn the attention of a passing cowboy with a kind heart, and gentle hands the man who would carry them both to safety, to family, to love.